Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is professor, writer, and student of American history, Dr. Allen Guelzo. He is a New York Times best-selling author, American historian, and commentator on public issues. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Christian Science Monitor. Among his many award-winning publications, he is the author of Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, which won the Lincoln Prize and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Prize. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, The End of Slavery in America, that also won the Lincoln Prize and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Prize. He also wrote Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America, and that was published in 2008. In all, he has won the Lincoln Prize on 3 occasions, and the Guggenheim Lehrman Prize as well. His most recent work is Robert E. Lee, A Life, which is an intimate look at the Confederate general and all his complexity. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of Robert E. Lee, A Life, George Will says, Allen C. Guelzo has written exactly what the nation urgently needs right now. An example of mature thinking about complex, flawed people who took difficult actions in context not of their own making or choosing. In today's blizzard of fossil, overheated, and grandstanding judgments about the past, this unsentimental biography illustrates the intellectual responsibility that the present owes to the past. And we are very pleased to have the esteemed scholar and decorated author with us today. Welcome, Dr. Guelzo.
Thank you so much. It's good to be talking to you today.
You're a very experienced historian, researcher, prolific writer. How difficult was it to research a figure of this magnitude that has such a mythology that's just baked into the historical record at this point?
Curiously enough, the mythology was probably the least forbidding part of it, because I knew what the mythology was and already mentally had taken steps to discount a good deal of it. What was actually a difficulty, and a major, maybe the most important difficulty in this book, was tracking down primary sources, and in this case especially the letters of Robert E. Lee. Lee was a compulsive letter writer. Now this is curious because he frequently talked about how much he hated office paperwork, and even his staff during the Civil War remarked on the fact that he preferred to let his staff handle most of the paperwork, incoming and outgoing, because he found it also distasteful. But in terms of personal correspondence, yes, definitely compulsive. He must have written, by my estimate, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 personal letters in his life. And the difficulty this poses is not just the sheer volume. That we could handle. It's that so many of these letters are scattered in so many different places and so many different directions. Mm-hmm. Unlike Abraham Lincoln, we have the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, all in 8 volumes and in one place. We have the personal papers of Ulysses S. Grant, and that's all in 26 or 27 volumes. We even have the papers of Jefferson Davis and Andrew Johnson, but we don't have a scholarly edition of papers, letters, and writings of Robert E. Lee. And I think this is the principal reason why. They are in so many different places, quite frequently in small penny packets, all the way from the Morgan Library in New York City to the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and at multiple places in between. Missouri has a connection with Lee letters. Georgia possesses Lee letters. Texas has got some Lee letters. Virginia obviously has some Lee letters. North Carolina has some Lee letters. you have to spend a lot of time tracking down the various paths of Lee correspondence because you never really know what might be coming around the corner next. And the thing which probably makes it strangest of all is that a great deal of Lee correspondence is still in private hands.
Yeah.
And things pop up frequently on auction sites, on eBay. I actually had two friends who more or less volunteered their services because they spent a lot of time on eBay, keeping an eye out for Lee letters that would show up on these auction sites and on eBay. Happily, a lot of them would come up and offer a transcription because I was in no position to buy these original letters of Robert E. Lee. But if they offer transcriptions, I hurriedly copied the transcription, made a note of the web source, and that would go into the book. The letters, of course, would then get sold and disappear into another private collection. But at least by that means, I was able to track down the text of a number of these elusive letters. There's just a lot of that in dealing with the Lee literature. And it's no wonder then that biographers will be willing to take on writing the life of the most obscure Civil War generals, but shy away, by and large, from writing about Robert E. Lee. It's just really hard to get the sources and get access to the sources all through one space or one source.
Dr. Guelzo, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Bob's Your Uncle English-style pale mild ale from the Virginia Beer Company of historic Williamsburg, Virginia. Bob's Your Uncle is brewed with a focus on using British ingredients, which creates a malty, clean, crisp, and drinkable beer. So if you find yourself in Virginia's colonial capital, head on over to the Virginia Beer Company and taste one of their amazing brews. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured beers. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply click on the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get the newest shows immediately right when they're released. And to the legion of listeners and supporters from 75 countries and more than 2,000 cities, I have to say thank you. And now, I raise my Bob's Your Uncle English-style pale mild ale very high. And to all of those dedicated to the sober, serious, and honest discussions about the past, and to conversations about the toughest aspects of American history, to all of those interested in the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear, I raise my glass and say cheers. Well, one of the things that people who read your book are really going to enjoy is how you tackle some of these misconceptions. And there are several about Robert E. Lee. One is that he grew up in an aristocratic family, a well-to-do family. It's a well-known family, but it's not well-to-do. Take me to that day when there's a young Robert E. Lee watching his famous father leave out the door for the West Indies, never to return. What type of impact did that have on his life?
Robert was 6 or 7 years old when his father left, and left for good. And this really came as almost the end of a long string of serious failures in the Lee family. You're absolutely right. I mean, there are Lees who are famous in American history. There's Richard Henry Lee, there's all the brothers Lee, who were so much part of Revolutionary history. But Robert E. Lee was actually the offspring of what you might call a cadet branch of the Lee family. Not the main line, so to speak, of the Lees, but rather a secondary part of the Lee family. And Lee's father, otherwise known as Light Horse Harry, from his experience as a cavalry commander in the Revolution, married into this larger Lee family as one of his cousins, but he himself was not part of it. And what's worse, although he was a talented cavalry commander under George Washington, in peacetime, both politically and financially, he was a total wreck. He made one enemy after another, politically speaking, including Thomas Jefferson. That was not a good person to have as an enemy in Virginia.
Not at all.
And what was worse, the man just burned through cash in one ill-advised real estate speculation after another. He followed the lead of a number of revolutionary officers in assuming that Investing in land in the West was going to be the way to make money because that was going to be what opened up and was developed very quickly and financially in a very profitable way. Well, Light Horse Harry managed to buy all the properties that nobody wanted. And as a result, he ended up, quite literally, in debtor's prison. Going, in fact, to debtor's prison rather than declare bankruptcy. If he had declared bankruptcy, he would have lost everything. But he lost a great deal as it was. When he comes out of debtor's prison, his wife, this is his second wife, Anne Carter Lee, finally decides she's fed up with what she's had to deal with her husband, because they were living on what had been Lee's first wife's estate, Stratford Hall. But my goodness, they had to sell off chunks of it. Light Horse Harry actually had to bar the door, literally bar the doors against creditors. And Anne Carter Lee says, I've had enough of this. We're moving. We're leaving Stratford. So they up and they move to Alexandria. And there it's a much more diminished existence. But even there, Light Horse Harry still couldn't get it right. He goes to Baltimore. He winds up being involved in a riot involving Federalists and Democrats, in which he's beaten to a pulp. I mean, almost within an inch of his life. And after that political drubbing, after all he's had to deal with the creditors, he finally decides, I've got to get out of here, and he leaves for the West Indies. He never makes it back to Virginia. He's in the West Indies for a number of years. He finally decides to return to America, but he only makes it as far as the coast of Georgia because he's developed cancer. And that's where he dies without ever laying eyes on his son, Robert, or his home in Virginia again.
Robert must have been struggling then for legitimacy his whole life. How important was it to him to have those familial connections to George Washington? Did you encounter that at all? Was that important to him?
Probably not. Although some people have speculated that Robert E. Lee was trying to work hard to be a kind of second Washington, I really do not find that the figure of Washington casts that great a shadow over Robert E. Lee. If there's a shadow, it's the shadow of his father, Light Horse Harry. And it's not a shadow that he's comfortable with. But you have to figure, and the psychologists will tell you this too, that there is hardly a more severe kind of trauma to inflict on someone before adolescence than the loss of a parent. But especially the loss of a parent under the circumstances in which Robert lost his father. And this is unspeakably humiliating. And it's baggage he has to carry around with him, because everyone will look at Robert E. Lee, and on the one hand, they will say, aha, the son of Light Horse Harry. Yeah, as if they could read his mind and figure out what that was generating in his thinking. But the other thing is, everyone would then say, Light Horse Harry, oh, yeah, him, yeah, right. That meant that would assume that Robert is just another apple from the familial tree. And if you trust Robert E. Lee, you'll get burned the same way you would have gotten burned by Light Horse Harry. And you might say, well, that's unfair. But remember, there were two wives of Light Horse Harry. His first wife, Matilda, who died, then his second wife, Anne Carter Lee, who outlives him. But Light Horse Harry had two children by Matilda, and one of them was a son. This would be Harry the Fourth. Harry the Fourth was even worse than Light Horse Harry. His conduct was so unspeakable that they called him Black Horse Harry Lee. So when you figure his half brother, when you figure his father, no wonder Robert E. Lee wonders if, when he's introduced to people, they avert their gaze because they're not really sure whether Robert's going to turn out to be the same commodity as these other cadet Lees.
There's another misconception that Lee was born to be a soldier, and that's not really the case. But based on that family situation that you're describing, he must have relished at least the stability that military life provided when he entered West Point in 1825.
Robert had four siblings. These were all the children of Light Horse Harry and Anne Carter Lee. Two daughters, Anne the younger and Mildred. And then he had two older brothers, Charles Carter Lee and Sidney Smith Lee. Charles Carter Lee, because he was the oldest, got whatever it was that Light Horse Harry had to lavish on him. Charles Carter Lee gets to go to Harvard. Not that Light Horse Harry's paying the bills. Actually, it's one of the Lee relatives, William Henry Fitzhugh, who's paying the bills for Charles Carter Lee to go to Harvard. Carter Lee goes to Harvard. He's a man about town. He's well loved. He's full of all the societies, graduates from Harvard, is going to become a lawyer, and is a total flop. He can't make a law practice work in New York City. He can't make a law practice work in Washington, D.C. What does he go off and do? He goes off to Western Virginia and tries to retrieve and develop the lands his father lost everything trying to develop. At one point in the 1830s, Charles Carter Lee is writing to his brother Robert saying, "You've got to come out here to Western Virginia and help me develop this. We're all going to be rich." You read the letters Robert wrote to Carter, and it's like, "Hey, that's a great idea, Carter. That's a great idea." And each letter loses a little bit more of enthusiasm. It's like, I'd like to come out to you, but I've got this other thing I've got to do. And then finally, after about 2 or 3 years, the letters are, "I'm not coming. I'm going to stay in the Army. I have to stay wedded to my Uncle Sam." This was the thing, you see. When Robert E. Lee goes to West Point, he's really going because the family can't send him anywhere else. All the money there was to be spent on education was spent on Carter. So Robert E. Lee goes to West Point, first of all, because it's free. Secondly, because Robert has a natural talent for mathematics, something which seemed to have escaped his other siblings. Well, West Point at this point, although it is the United States Military Academy and is supposed to provide officers for the U.S. Army, is also the preeminent engineering school in the United States. In fact, until the 1830s, it's really the only engineering school in the United States. So Robert goes to West Point. He goes through all 4 years. He graduates second in his class and is commissioned into the Corps of Engineers, the elite of the elite. And that provides him with exactly the measure of stability and security that he'd never had because of the family situation he'd had to grow up with. It's finally when he's in the Army that there's predictability. He's not going to get fired. He's not going to lose his job. His business is not going to go bankrupt. It's the one profession in pre Civil War America which you might say had tenure built into it. And that is what really attracts Robert E. Lee. He can depend on the Army, and he can depend on what the Army will do for him as an engineer.
He had a steady rise and a successful career as an Army engineer. The Mexican War starts in 1846, and Lee is placed on the staff of General Winfield Scott in 1847. It appears at that point that his trajectory in the military seems to change dramatically.
Yes, but only briefly. Lee was afraid he was going to miss the Mexican War completely. We don't often today think of war as something that you just don't want to miss. But in the 19th century, war for serving officers in the United States Army, whether the engineers or otherwise, that meant advancement. It meant promotion. It meant opportunity. And Lee at first thought he was going to be simply passed by and left where he was posted at Fort Hamilton on the Narrows, guarding New York City, access to New York City. But then he gets the orders, first of all, to report to Texas. Then he's moved over to serve under Winfield Scott. Scott is going to use him, first of all, as an engineer, because he's a good engineer officer. Winfield Scott had a real sharp eye for talent, and he soon realizes that Robert E. Lee has got more going for him than just drawing engineering diagrams and working with algorithms. He sees that Lee has a real eye for terrain, for the lay of the land. He begins to employ Lee as a reconnaissance officer. And in fact, during his great invasion all the way to Mexico City and the capture of Mexico City, Scott comes increasingly to rely on Robert E. Lee to take charge of his scouting, his intelligence, his reconnaissance work. So much so that years later, Scott would tell Senator Reverdy E. Johnson that most of the glory that he, Scott, earned from the capture of Mexico City really was due to Robert E. Lee. Now, Lee doesn't command troops. He's acting purely as a staffer for Winfield Scott. But it is a moment when Lee does at least taste real action. The problem is it doesn't get him anything permanent. It gets him 2 honorary promotions called brevets, but no real promotion. He is still stuck at the rank of captain And he's been in the Army for 20 years,
Mm.
but he's still stuck at the rank of captain. And what's worse, when the Mexican War is over, the Army sends him right back to the same engineering jobs as he had before. They post him at Fort Carroll in Baltimore Harbor, where he is going to be the engineer who basically builds Fort Carroll from, there's a little island in the middle of Baltimore Harbor. He goes back to being more of the same. And the question has to occur to him, am I going to see any kind of improvement? Well, he does see a change. The question is whether it's an improvement. Because after working for 2 or 3 years with Fort Carroll, he's then reassigned. He doesn't get to finish Fort Carroll. In fact, Fort Carroll is still sitting there in Baltimore Harbor, unfinished, more or less in the condition Robert E. Lee left it. Lee is instead directed to take charge as superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Now, you might think that's a great advancement for him. Think again. It's really, if anything, even more frustrating.
Well, I have a few questions about his personal life. And the first question is, did his marriage to Mary Custis change his financial or social status? And then I'm just wondering, based on your research, what kind of husband and father was he? Because when you see him in stone, as he's often seen today, he seems very stern and cold.
The curious thing is that Robert E. Lee, almost as though he was determined to be the diametric opposite of his father, is the almost perfect model of the 19th century bourgeois family man. He adores his children, and his children adore him. It's really one of these remarkable situations when you compare Lee's own childhood to the childhood his children enjoyed. His children had this perfect idyll. They had his attention utterly and completely. Mary Custis Lee, his wife, she's much more demanding. She is the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, who himself was the step-grandson of George Washington. George Washington Parke Custis was actually the grandson of Martha Washington from her first marriage to John Parke Custis. But George Washington takes charge of the boy, and for as long as Washington himself is alive, that's his grandfather.
Sure.
George Washington Parke Custis inherits Custis properties. He inherits Washington properties. He is, at least on paper, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. He is an amiable dunce. There's really no other way to do it. This is a man who putters at this, putters at that, putters at the other thing, never really does anything of any substance. What he does is inherit 3 properties, 2 of them in central Virginia on the Pamunkey River, and this marvelous property right on the Potomac, right across from the Capitol, where he builds an impressive house that he names Arlington. Well, this, of course, is what is today Arlington National Cemetery. That is the great Custis House perched on top of a bluff overlooking the Potomac and overlooking the Capitol. He looked on the surface like he was one of the grandees of Virginia. In fact, he mismanaged the properties, the money, everything that went into Arlington and the other properties. He mismanaged it so poorly that, in fact, all of his wealth was really on paper, and in true fact, people were cheating him blind, contractors, managers, employers, because he was just too nice, and they couldn't resist fleecing him. And he allowed himself to be fleeced. His daughter, Mary, the only child, and Mary is, I suppose if we could translate it into modern jargon, Mary is a spoiled brat. And she is more in love with Arlington than she is with Robert E. Lee. Every time Lee is posted someplace, there's always this tug of war. Is Mary going to join him? Well, even when she does join him, when she joins him at Fort Monroe, when he's posted there, at Fort Hamilton, in St. Louis, all the places Lee serves in his career as an engineer, she always finds some reason to flee back to Arlington. Arlington is what she loves, that and her parents there at Arlington. And there's almost this tug of war that Lee has to deal with, between his wife's affection for Arlington and his wife's affection for himself. He's never cruel. He's never faithless. He's diligent in always making sure she's provided for, especially after she develops rheumatoid arthritis in the 1850s, a slow disease which eventually simply cripples her. But at the same time, there's a certain element of impatience and frustration. And it shows up occasionally in the letters. He writes a letter to his oldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, when he's in Texas. And he writes to Custis and says, now make sure that your mother has a little spending money, but don't let her go shopping.
So that's not a modern, just a modern situation.
But, that resonates in some modern contexts too. But you get the sense that Lee loved his wife, but at the same time, Mary Custis Lee was more a Custis than she was a Lee, and that meant that Robert always had, to a certain degree, to be on his guard.
Dr. Guelzo, I think there's a misconception that the vast majority of people in the 19th century valued an allegiance to their state over an allegiance to the federal Constitution. This certainly isn't the case for Ulysses Grant. He says so almost immediately after the war starts, and he's not in the Army at all. He's just serving he's working at his father's tannery or his family's tannery in Galena. Would you take me through Lee's decision to turn down that command in the U.S. Army that was offered to him after the war starts?
It's often said that Lee turns down the offer that is made through Francis Preston Blair, but really originating with Lincoln. Because he was so loyal to Virginia, he couldn't raise his arm against Virginia. He couldn't draw his sword against Virginia. That almost becomes a mantra for him. And I'm always suspicious about mantras. I'm always suspicious about formulas that get trotted out too easily. And I'm always on the lookout for moments when the formula breaks up and something else pops out, which it does with Lee. What was Lee trying to do? Well, is Lee really, first of all, this devoted son of the Old Dominion? Well, think about it. Lee is born at Stratford Hall on the northern neck of Virginia. But when the family moves to Alexandria, well, Alexandria at that point was not actually part of Virginia. It was part of the District of Columbia. The Virginia side, so to speak, of the District of Columbia was not retroceded to Virginia until long after Robert E. Lee had left Alexandria to go to West Point and start on a career of his own. So from Alexandria, when he's living in Alexandria, he's really a citizen of the District of Columbia rather than Virginia. From there, of course, he goes to West Point, 4 years at West Point in New York. From there, he goes to Georgia. That's his first posting at what will become Fort Pickens. From there to Fortress Monroe. Well, right, that's Virginia. But after that, it's to St. Louis, Missouri. Then it's to Fort Hamilton, again, New York. And that's one of the longest assignments he has. He's involved in the Mexican War, comes out of the Mexican War. He's in Baltimore. Then from there, New York again as superintendent of West Point. And from there, after he's commissioned as lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Cavalry, he spends a number of years, he spends actually 7 years in Texas. So when the Civil War breaks out, when the secession crisis begins, he's not even in Virginia physically. He's in Texas. And one of the ironies is, in February of 1865, when the secession crisis was boiling to its peak, and Texas was contemplating secession from the Union, and then, of course, actually does secede from the Union, Robert E. Lee starts taking polls of his officers in Texas, determined to defend United States posts and United States property there. And the irony of that is that it is entirely conceivable that the Civil War might have started as a shooting war, not over Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, but over one of these posts like Camp Cooper in Texas, with Robert E. Lee defending the United States flag and United States property. That would have made for an interesting twist on the future of American history. He's recalled from Texas by order of Winfield Scott. He's in Washington at Arlington from March through till almost the end of April 1861. It's just after mid-April that he is summoned to this meeting with Francis Preston Blair, and he's made the offer of command of the field armies and refuses. He then goes to Winfield Scott, bids farewell to Scott. It's when he's with Scott that something in that formula breaks down. Because as he explains to Scott, my family, my children, Their property is all over there across the river. I have to protect that. You see, when George Washington Parke Custis, the father-in-law, died, in his will, believe it or not, he cut Robert out of the will completely, or almost completely. He wills Robert one or two small property lots in the District of Columbia. But Robert does not inherit, and Mary does not inherit Arlington from the father. Instead, Arlington is willed by George Washington Parke Custis to his grandson, to Robert E. Lee's oldest son, George Washington Custis Lee. What Lee feels he has to do is he has to protect that property for his family, or else they're going to lose it and they're going to be destitute. So what he is figuring is this. If he takes command of the Union armies and Virginia secedes from the Union, because Virginia had not yet seceded, if Virginia secedes from the Union, they will certainly seize the Arlington property. They'll seize it partly out of retribution, but they'll seize it because it's militarily significant. You put a couple of batteries of artillery up on that bluff, and you're commanding the entire national capital. If he accepts that command, he's going to cost his family Arlington. On the other hand, if Virginia secedes and he goes with Virginia, then he saves Arlington. And what's more, if he goes with Virginia, he can become an agent for a peace settlement that will reconstruct the Union peaceably and get over the secession crisis. One thing we don't often factor into this is that in mid-April of 1861, even after the firing in Fort Sumter, it was still not clear there was going to be a war. People had said over and over and over again, what's going to happen is the country's going to break up into 4 or 5 different confederacies, and then after a while, everyone's going to get together in a new national convention, and we're going to reconstruct the Union on that basis. And when Lee goes off to Richmond, he's doing it as his cousin, Cassius Francis Lee, explained. You're going to go to Richmond, and you're going to help broker a peace settlement, and you will emerge as a man with a greater reputation than Washington. If Washington led us in war, Robert E. Lee will preserve us in peace. Of course, when he gets to Richmond, he finds out that the horse has already long since galloped out of that stable. But when he goes off it, what is he thinking when he makes this decision? He is thinking the only way he can think in the immediate context of what was known in mid-April 1861, and that is, I need to preserve this property for my family. And that's not a matter of some mystical, romantic attachment to Virginia. It's a very practical, hard-nosed way of saying, I've got to save my family from the possibility of future penury.
Well, that's fascinating. And of course, he rises in the military structure and the hierarchy of the Confederacy. After that, I won't get into the specifics of the war, but I do have one interesting point. I'm going to level a little criticism towards General Lee. He's known as a great field commander. And this criticism isn't actually about Gettysburg, but actually about his greatest victory, the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, you could tell me if I'm misguided, Dr. Guelzo, but so he does defeat General Hooker at that battle. But at the end of the battle, not only does he lose his great General Stonewall Jackson, but he loses 20% of his force. Did that victory actually put a tremendous strain on the Confederacy?
The curious thing is that there are 2 great victories that Lee wins almost back to back. One is Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and then Chancellorsville in May of 1863. Lee said afterwards, and this is a remarkable statement from him, Lee said afterwards, everybody was so enthused over these victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Everybody was dancing with joy. He said, I was more depressed than ever. I was more depressed than ever because these battles had been fought on Virginia soil. And all that happened at the end was that the federal forces retreated, but only retreated back to other positions in Virginia. They still held on to large chunks of Southern territory. All that Lee had done was keep them from getting any further deeper into Virginia. And he had lost soldiers he could not replace, whereas the Union losses could be made up relatively easily. So his estimate of the situation was, if we keep up at this rate, we're just simply going to get eventually pounded to pieces. That was actually an insight that I think underscores, well, let me say parenthetically, your suspicion about Chancellorsville is right. And the person who would agree most heartily with you is Robert E. Lee himself. But the larger context of this is that Lee saw strategically speaking, that the Confederacy could not go a long 15-round heavyweight bout with the North. He had lived in the North. He had seen the North. He understood what the resources were. He understood that the Confederacy simply didn't have the wherewithal to maintain that kind of a war. If the Confederacy was going to win, it was going to have to score a knockout, a surprise knockout, early in the first or second round. And the only way to do that was to cross the Potomac and take the war north into Pennsylvania. That's, of course, what he does in the fall of 1862. It's what he does again in June of 1863. He does that because he understands the South can't win militarily. It just doesn't have the wherewithal. But it can win politically. It can win politically by going north and on northern soil, defying any effort by the Lincoln administration to track them down and defeat them, maybe even winning a full-scale battle against a Union army somewhere in Pennsylvania. If they can do that, that's going to turn the politics of the North so heavily against the Lincoln administration that the Lincoln administration will be forced politically to come to the negotiating table with the Confederacy. And once the negotiations start, there's not going to be any foreseeable end to them except independence for the Confederacy. Lee understands that. That is the way the war is going to be won. He nearly pulled it off. He nearly pulled it off in 1862, lunging over the Potomac, heading for Pennsylvania. And since the man who was chasing him was George McClellan, who, as Lincoln said, might have been a great engineer, but only when you think about a stationary engine, McClellan would otherwise have followed Lee so cautiously and so considerately that Lee could have rambled around the Pennsylvania countryside all through the fall of 1862. And of course, in the fall of 1862, there's congressional elections and there's gubernatorial elections in some northern states. Lee could have made the most of that, except that on that critical moment, September 13th, 1862, Lee's campaign orders are picked up in a field in Maryland, near Frederick, Maryland, by two soldiers of the 27th Indiana. And it goes up a chain of command like lightning and into McClellan's hands. And McClellan knows then exactly what Lee's dispositions are. So he chases Lee. For the first time in his life, George McClellan moves fast, chases Lee, pins him against the Potomac River, and the Battle of Antietam results. Lee survives Antietam, and his army survives Antietam. But Lee can't wait to try again. And that's what he does again in June of 63, and what produces the Battle of Gettysburg. And once again, Robert E. Lee comes within an ace of succeeding at Gettysburg. And if he has succeeded, well, look, in the fall elections in 1862, the Lincoln administration lost something like 35 seats in the House of Representatives. It lost the governorships of New York and New Jersey. If, in 1863, Lee had been successful at Gettysburg, there were gubernatorial elections in Pennsylvania and Ohio coming up that October. If Lee had won some kind of victory in Pennsylvania, those elections would have gone to anti-administration candidates. And then you would have had the solid middle chunk of the North, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, in the hands of anti-Lincoln administration governors who would have folded their arms and said, we are not cooperating further. There's been enough bloodshed. We need to open negotiations. Lee saw that. If there is one area in which Lee is heads and shoulders above anybody else in the Confederacy, it is his strategic perception that that was the formula for winning the war.
After the death of his father-in-law's will stipulated that his slaves would be freed, and Lee was responsible for the administration and execution of that. He's very frustrated by this. I'm sure he didn't want to deal with that responsibility at that time. It's a tremendous amount of criticism leveled at Lee, though, by the way he executed those duties. He instituted very strict rules for those slaves, harsh penalties, in some cases, alleged cruelty. Are the modern criticisms of that time warranted?
Yes and no. And the reason I give you this ambivalent answer is because, bear in mind the fact, here's the irony of Old Man Custis's will. He cuts Robert out of the will, but he makes Robert the executor. And he makes Robert responsible, under the terms of the estate, for emancipating some 190 slaves owned by old Custis. And Lee must do it within 5 years. In other words, by December of 1862. Now, here's where things start to get next to impossible. At the same time as that is a provision for the will. I mean, if that had been the only thing in the will, Robert E. Lee could simply have sat down, written out the manumission papers, and been done with it. There's another hitch. There are also a series of legacies which have to be paid first to old Custis's grandchildren. In other words, to Lee's children. $10,000 each to Lee's daughters. Well, $10,000, even today, is nothing to sniff at. It was a fortune in 1857. The problem is that Arlington and the other two Custis properties were in such economic disarray. They weren't generating anything, much less $10,000. And yet, Lee is obligated by the terms of the will to settle on the Custis grandchildren, his children, these $10,000 legacies. So what does he have to do? He has to make Arlington and the other properties financially viable. And to do that, he has to make them turn a profit. And he goes at it the way any engineer in the Army would go at it. And that is, you do it strictly logically, you do it by the book, you make people work. If they don't want to work, you find ways of making them work. This was a man who spent his life in the Army. That was the way he treated people, and that was the way he treated the slaves at Arlington and the other two properties. That was a novelty for them. Old man Custis had pretty much let the slave population, especially at Arlington, look out for itself, create its own gardens, sell its own produce to anybody who wanted to come along and buy it. Partly that was because of old man Custis's sense of guilt. Custis himself once referred to slavery as the vulture that was eating out the South's vitals. And yet he was a man of such weak will that even though he could see the wrong of slavery, he does nothing about it. He leaves that to his will, and he leaves it to his son-in-law, a mess for his son-in-law to clean up. Well, the son-in-law pitches in as an Army engineer would, and suddenly it's a whole different ballgame at Arlington. And the Arlington slaves balk at this. That's not the way they're used to being treated. But Lee is going to make them do that. Their response, some occasions, is to run away. When 3 of them are apprehended and returned, Lee is so beside himself that, according to at least one description, he actually takes a whip in hand and scourges these runaways. Afterwards, he's very oblique about what happened. A report of this leaks out into the newspapers. It's printed in the New York Tribune. And Lee writes to his oldest son, and he says to him, I suppose you've seen what the New York Tribune had to say about me. The only comment he will make is, your grandfather wished a very unpleasant legacy on me. It was as though Robert E. Lee, with his fabled self-control and dignity, at that moment saw those runaways as a threat to the future of his family. And he responds to them the way I think that Robert wished his own father had responded to the creditors that hounded them. Now, I'm speculating here because I'm not a psychologist, and I don't want to be prosecuted for practicing psychology without a license. But I'm looking at this situation and thinking, this is so uncharacteristic of Robert E. Lee. Why? What would generate that? And I think this situation just touches a traumatic nerve that's very deeply buried in Lee, and he responds that way. And it's cruel. What he does is vicious. And afterwards, he does not want to talk about it. And I think the reason he does not want to talk about it is largely because he is so deeply embarrassed by what he has done. Robert E. Lee was another person, another one of these Upper South figures, intelligent with enough perception to see, as he once put it, that slavery was a moral and political evil in any country. And yet, as much as he can see that, he sees it and then he looks away. He says, I can't do anything about it. It's going to take time for the situation to change, and we're just going to have to wait for God's will and God's moment for slavery to come to an end. He sees, and then he looks away, just like his father-in-law did, and in fact, just like a lot of Upper Southerners did. There were people in the South who wanted to talk about slavery as a positive good and how wonderful slavery was Well, Robert E. Lee was not one of them, nor was his father-in-law. The problem was he wouldn't do anything to take a step against it. And when that explosion occurs, Robert E. Lee cannot quite entirely understand himself, I think. Again, as I say, I'm speculating here. But I think that Robert E. Lee looked upon that incident as something that deeply, deeply embarrassed him because it was not the person he wanted to be. At that moment, he was actually behaving more like his father as a revolutionary officer, cutting off the heads of deserters. So it is one of the worst moments in Lee's life. You look back and you just cannot find anything in it to sympathize with. At the same time, though, what is curious is he moves ahead. At the same time as he's moving ahead to create those legacies, to make Arlington turn a profit that will generate the legacies the estate requires him to pay. At the same time, he also keeps moving ahead with the emancipation program. And in December of 1862, he does, in fact, emancipate all the Custis slaves. I think that's unusual in the sense that by December of 1862, he has ceased to be Robert E. Lee, the son of Light Horse Harry. He has now become General Lee, the famous General Lee, in his own right. If Robert E. Lee had gone into any Virginia Confederate court and said to a judge, I just don't think we can go through with this emancipation, I can't imagine any Virginia judge telling General Lee, no, you can't do that. No, if Lee had wanted to, he could have thrown that whole emancipation business to the winds, but he doesn't. And what's more, Robert E. Lee only owned one slave family in his own lifetime, and that was a slave family he inherited from his mother. He emancipates them, too. Even though he's not obligated to, it's got nothing to do with the Custis will. He emancipates them, too. So by the beginning of 1863, Robert E. Lee, the great general of the Confederacy, is slaveless.
So Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox in April of 1865, and the soldiers from the Army of Northern Virginia return home, mostly with their property, paroled. I'm wondering about that indictment later. I think it was in the court of Judge Underwood. Was Lee ever concerned that might actually come to trial, conviction, and of course the punishment of that would have been death by hanging? Did he have any concern about that?
Oh, he did indeed. I mean, that runs through many of the letters he wrote in 1865, 66, and 67. He keeps constantly referring to the progress of any threatened trial. He is very concerned that he has become this marked man and that he is going to be punished for this. I think, in fact, that's one reason why he accepts the job as president of Washington College. It's a very unlikely job for him to have taken. When he was superintendent of West Point, he was, for all practical purposes, the president of a college. He hated it. I mean, from start to finish, he just hated being superintendent of West Point. And when you think of Washington College at the end of the Civil War, it was in immensely worse shape than West Point had ever been. The college hardly had a pulse as a result of the war. And yet Lee accepts the presidency of it way there, far away in the Shenandoah Valley and in Lexington, Virginia. And you scratch your head and you think, why? He didn't particularly like this kind of job. Why does he do it? Because Lexington is about as far away from Washington as you can get and still be in Virginia and still observing the terms of the parole from Appomattox. He wants to get away from visibility. He wants to be in a place where he's not going to be constantly reminding people in Washington who he is and where he is. And I guess that element that he's trying to minimize himself as a target, that he takes the job in Lexington. Now, the two peculiar things about this is the indictment that was handed down in June of 1865 against Lee and some 35 other Confederate leaders. That indictment never results in a trial. And it never results in a trial largely because Ulysses S. Grant obstructs it. Ulysses S. Grant had given Lee and his army paroles. And as far as Grant was concerned, that was a promise of honor that they would not be molested if they surrendered, laid down their arms, and went home peacefully. When it looks like not only Judge Underwood, but in fact Attorney General Speed and President Andrew Johnson are interested in prosecuting Lee, Grant frankly tells President Johnson, if you try to prosecute Lee, if you override the paroles that I gave, I will resign as General in Chief of the Army. Well, Andrew Johnson can't afford to have that happen politically. That would be too great an embarrassment. So Johnson backs off, James Speed backs off, Underwood grudgingly backs off. And that in large measure is why the indictment never comes to trial. There's actually a few other reasons, but that's going to take us into the legal weeds. It all finally dissolves on Christmas Day, 1868, when Andrew Johnson, who's on his way out of the presidency, issues a comprehensive amnesty that will cover Robert E. Lee. And it's not until then that Lee can really breathe deeply and feel that he's free from the possible onus of this indictment. And you may be wondering, why would Robert E. Lee feel he had something to fear from this Judge Underwood person, or even from Andrew Johnson? You should not underestimate the degree of rage that possessed the North after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Grant gives those paroles the 9th of April, 1865. And what happens just 5 days later? The assassination of Lincoln. Suddenly, everybody forgets what Lincoln's talked about in the second inaugural, about malice toward none and charity for all. People wanted revenge, and Lee was a prime target for that revenge. So Lee had good reason to be concerned that the indictment was going to lead to a treason trial, and the treason trial would, of course, had no other conceivable ending than an execution. That doesn't happen, though. And Lee is allowed to remain in peace in Lexington as president of Washington College, where I have to add, as unlikely a president as Robert E. Lee should have made, he actually turns into a very effective college president. He takes Washington College, which is just about flat on its back, and within 5 years, he has built it into a major educational institution in Virginia, almost as big as the University of Virginia itself. He rebuilds the student population, he rebuilds the faculty, and surprise within surprise, he turns out to be one really savvy fundraiser. He really knows how to shake the apples out of the trees. Today, we'd say he would make a great development officer. And all this he accomplishes in those last 5 years of his life, which, frankly, I think were probably the happiest years of his life. Because it's in those years he gets to satisfy the three great urges of his life: for security, for independence, and for perfection. He gets to have them all at Washington College. So it's a surprise ending for the life of Robert E. Lee. But as I say, I think it's an ending where he was probably happier than at any other earlier point in his life.
What's his view of Ulysses S. Grant?
It's curious because at first, during the war itself, he tended to discount Grant. He soon learned that that was a mistake, that Grant had learned the same lesson he had learned from Winfield Scott in Mexico during campaign to Mexico City, and that is the lesson of the continuous offensive. When Lee goes to Appomattox, he is fearful that Grant is going to demand something that Lee himself cannot agree to. Grant has the reputation of being unconditional surrender Grant, that stemming from the surrender at Fort Donelson back in February of 1862. Lee is fearful that if he goes and meets with Grant, Grant's going to demand unconditional surrender, and unconditional surrender means that any of the officers of the Army of Northern Virginia can be put on trial for treason. The soldiers of the Army can be marched in some kind of death march to prison camps, or maybe even made part of some Roman triumph in the streets of Washington or New York City. And if that's going to be the case, then Lee had already resolved, no, we'll fight it out here to the last man at Appomattox. When Lee goes to meet with Grant, Grant has an entirely different proposal to make. Paroles for everybody. Everybody gets to go home. Ordinary soldiers get to claim horses and mules. Officers get to keep their sidearms. That's a symbolic point. Lee is so surprised by this. It's exactly what he might have hoped for, and so he agrees to it. What he didn't realize is that Grant didn't have much choice. Grant's pursuit of Lee after the fall of Richmond on April 2nd, Grant's pursuit of Lee had been so helter-skelter that Grant had left his baggage, his supplies, everything miles and miles and miles behind. And years after the war, Grant said, If Lee had not agreed to surrender at Appomattox, I would have had to break off the pursuit. He wouldn't have had anything to feed his army with. So, in a sense, both Lee and Grant have aces up their sleeve. Grant knows he's got to make Lee an offer he can't refuse. Otherwise, Grant will be able to continue the pursuit. But Lee also knows that if Grant comes in with this hard-nosed, unconditional surrender bid, Lee's officers are telling him, then we will scatter to the mountains, the army will take its weapons with it, and we will fight a guerrilla war. And a guerrilla war? From one end of the Appalachians to the other? That could have consumed this nation for the next 30 years. And think of what kind of horrors would have been visited on us. I mean, we had a bad enough time mismanaging Reconstruction. That kind of a scenario would have been infinitely worse. But when Grant makes the offer about paroles, Lee says, all right, we don't need to think about scattering to the hillsides, no unconditional surrender. We can accept what Grant is offering. Both of them have something to gain, and both of them gain it. After that, Lee is willing to say that Grant is a very fine man indeed. And yet there are qualifications. Grant and Lee meet the day after the surrender is arranged. And there, the meeting is a little bit more chilly. In the years after the war, Grant invites Lee to visit him at the White House. This is after Grant has been elected president. What Grant wants is for Lee to come in and endorse certain Reconstruction policies. Because if Lee will endorse them, that'll help dampen down Southern resistance. Lee visits the White House, meets with Grant for about 15 or 20 minutes. It's pretty icy. It's very polite, but it's icy. Lee is making no offers. And Grant doesn't have any leverage, so Grant can't get what he wants from Lee. That's the last time the two of them meet. Afterwards, someone asks Robert E. Lee who he thought the greatest Union general was. Believe it or not, Lee says George B. McClellan without any question. Now, you have to believe that part of that was, all right, yes, he had respect for McClellan. McClellan was not a dunce. You also have to believe that part of that was for public consumption as a slap at Grant. Funny thing is, Grant slaps back. Years later, when he's on his round-the-world tour, he tells John Russell Young, a journalist who was accompanying him on this tour, because Young asked Grant the question, who does he think the greatest Confederate general was? Grant's response is Joseph E. Johnston. So I think there's a little tit for tat going on there. And the relationship between them, it was not cordial. And in a sense, you can understand it because Lee had to suffer his greatest professional humiliation at the hands of this man, Grant. And even though he gets possibly the best terms that anyone could have possibly offered him from Grant, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be grateful. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be in awe of Ulysses Grant. If anything, there's probably going to be a slow, deep burn of resentment that this man defeated me. All right, I'll acknowledge he defeated me, but that doesn't mean I'm going to love him.
The last question I have for you is, in regards to the iconoclasm of today, the defacing, destroying of statues, and in other cases, just taking them down, is this just righting a wrong in history, or do you think recently we've gone and taken it a little bit too far?
I'd be easier in my own mind. I'd find it easier to believe that we're righting some kind of historical wrong. If I saw in a lot of these defacements and topplings a logical, a careful, a thoughtful process. Instead, a great deal of what I see is impulse, rage, hate, emotion. And those are always dangerous things to turn loose on history because, of course, history can't fight back. A monument can't resist. So back in 2017, after the Charlottesville riot, I sat down with one of my former students, John Rudy, who is an interpretive officer with the National Park Service. And together we devised a decision tree. In other words, if we're thinking about renamings or removals of statues, let's do it as part of a process where we have carefully taken a step-by-step view of things. And we published this decision tree in Civil War Monitor. Your listeners can look that up there. And we created this decision tree because the feeling was very strong that when you destroy a historical edifice, you can't replace it. The Tate Gallery in London has estimated that at the time of the Protestant Reformation, something like 70% of England's religious art was destroyed. But the people who did it were zealots. The people who did it thought they had the world's best reason for doing what they were doing, because this was religious art that was going to decoy people's souls into hell. So we were perfectly legitimate in destroying statues and stained glass windows and what have you. We look back on that now and we hit our foreheads with the palm of our hands and we say, what were they thinking? All that destruction, all that iconoclasm, what exactly did it get? What did it produce? I hope that we do not find ourselves 50 years on or so saying the same thing. What were we thinking then? And I think we can only be sure that we have avoided that kind of situation if we are cautious, if we are reasonable, if we are logical in what we do. Because when you do that sort of thing, when you do that kind of iconoclasm, you can't repair it. You can't put it back. It's never going to come back. So my basic instinct is to say, let caution and let reason reign here. And maybe what we'll come to will be, at the end of the decision tree, a decision to remove a statue or to change a name. That may be. But let that be at the end of a process that respects the past itself and respects the operation of prudence rather than an impulse. Impulse is what's dangerous. Impulse, when it rules politics, is what gives us book burnings. It gives us what in the 20th century we have all too often found to be the most hideous embarrassments. We don't feel the embarrassment at the moment, but we feel it later on. I would like to say, before we take the risk of a hangover, let's be sure we know what we're drinking first.
Well, thank you, Dr. Guelzo. That was excellent stuff. And I think people are really going to enjoy this book. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and to talk about Robert E. Lee and the Civil War era, which is, when you come right down to it, really the Iliad of American history.
I would like to thank my guest, American historian and scholar, Dr. Allen Guelzo. And if you would like to get his brand new book, Robert E. Lee, A Life, simply click on the link in the description below. Of the book, Michael Lind, author of What Lincoln Believes, says, one of America's greatest Lincoln scholars, Allen Guelzo, has written the definitive biography of Robert E. Lee for our time. Our featured brew was Bob's Your Uncle English-style Pale Mild Ale from the Virginia Beer Company of historic Williamsburg, Virginia. And if you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And if you want more information on shows, books, and authors, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the outstanding North Carolina band Bones Fork, and their brand new album, Beautiful Circle, is available now. And finally, to the growing list of listeners from around the globe, once again, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.